Now, if we look at the gold-silver ratio versus CPI, you can see that, again, a very strong correlation to the US CPI lags 6 months and the gold-silver ratio inverted. What that suggests that the CPI is going to go negative, that this might be the peak in year-over-year growth. And you can see the gold-silver ratio is back to where it was in 08-09. I look at this and I say, okay, it's back to where it was in 08-09. What was the situation in 08-09? And we all know what that was. So it looks to me like CPI is going to come back down. Now you could argue, okay, perhaps the CPI is leading and it means that the gold-silver ratio now is going to go back up. But when the charts are at extremes, or when they are deviations from the mean that are significant, 2, 3, 4 times, or the spread between two assets or two markets and are wider than they have been, I look at those types of things. Especially when correlations which have existed for a long time have held up. And then they change. So, my only thought here is that the correlation reasserts itself.
Okay.
Right? This ratio, which has always meant, always had a strong correlation with CPI, would suggest to me that we go negative. And the German CPI numbers that just came out, surprised to the downside. Japanese inflation is low. Chinese PPI has been negative for 4 years, and CPI has been 1%, which I think is unnatural for an economy growing that quickly. So maybe the real problem is that we have structural deflation, and that, in fact, the central banks and the governments haven't acted more aggressively. And maybe that's what is driving the pressure on the banking systems, not just the regulations and the fines. Maybe there is that pernicious deflation that's building, and I think gold may be sensing that, sensing that the authorities will do everything they can again. Now, whether it works or not is a different issue.
Well, what happens to the banking industry in a period where there's sustained negative interest rates?
Well, I think that's part of the reason why you've had pressure on the banks. I know in Sweden, where they've had negative rates, the banks every quarter are reporting losses because they won't bring the deposits below zero for people who hold money because, can you imagine?
Their capital would just fly out the door.
Right. And if you could imagine 2008 in the US and everywhere, we bailed out the banks. And I think people generally feel that there's something wrong with that. Like, why weren't those banks allowed to fail, or not some of them? So I actually think that that's part of what's driving this populist upswell, because somehow people recognize there's a problem there. Now, if the banks had to bring rates below zero for the populace, I think there would be massive complaints, and I don't know how some sort of uprising or backlash would form, or what form it would take. But I think it's quite obvious. You see now the people shifting between Sanders and over to Trump is a strong suggestion that people think that there's something wrong.
Right.
And in the back of my mind, that started in 08. People felt there's something unfair. I have a small, if they're saying to themselves, I have a small business, I had rough times, no one bailed me out. As a fund manager, when I'm down 4 or 5% on the year, no one bails me out. And so I think that was the first seed planted in people's minds.
Sure.
If negative rates were to come to the U.S., or even zero rates, I think the banks would suffer because they would have a very hard time passing that onto the population. And if in fact they tried, we'd have a big problem. And of course that again would be very positive for physical gold. You might not want to hold your gold then in the banking system. And again, perhaps hold it, outside the U.S. or, wherever you felt most comfortable.